When I want to know about esports, I go to his channel. This is Steele, and you're watching Thorin.
Right, so obviously it's time for one of my Patreon AMAs. You can check out the link below if you want to do that. And of course, we're starting off with the Barbara Stanwyck's legs, aren't we? Because he's always in there. This time it's not even about Quake, so ooh, interesting. Question is, assuming you still disdain the $100 kill reward on the AWP, who doesn't? Have I missed something, by the way? Why has everyone just accepted that? It shows how, by the way, people are essentially in the modern day. It does feel like people in the modern day are just conditioned to be slaves. You know what I mean? Like to just any authority. As soon as a consensus is even set among your peers, you just do your brilliant. Yeah, oh, he did win that fight because the judges say so. Oh, my friends think Brady is then he must be the best because of the, like, how about have your own opinion? So I will just say, like, I'm amazed that people just never talk about that. Like, as far as I know, by the way, almost every, like, actual, like, legit expert I ever talked to, there's plenty of other things about the AWP they'll disagree with me on, and is it more powerful, is it the best, blah, blah, blah. Almost no one, though, have I ever heard go, yeah, the 100 kill reward's totally fine, and actually makes a lot of sense. So, okay, assuming I disdain it, spoiler, I think I've given it away. I do, in fact, disdain it still. How much would you make it if given the opportunity to change it? The obvious answer is, I played 1.6, I would just make it $300, just like the AK and the M4, just to make a level of parity between the guns. But, with that said, and by the way, I'll even throw this in there, that's even a mad area I've just realised. There's like a random epiphany. Isn't that actually mad? That you'd actually think that would even be an element of coaching. Like, if you know anything about the NFL, there are certain aspects where, like, for example, you don't run a touchdown in, you just fall just short if you want to waste time on the clock so they can't possibly score at all and ever win the game. There's certain scenarios where you do, like, little sort of, like, smart, like, plus EV plays, which aren't necessarily super intuitive. They're counterintuitive a little bit, but if you understand it's how you get the edges in the game. The thing about the 2-minute warning in the NFL with the touchdowns, the timeouts and all that jazz. So as a result, I've actually just realised in Counter-Strike, that's actually kind of mad. Because we're just trying to win the round, there might actually be times where if the IGL looked at the money, bearing in mind people can talk when they're dead, if the IGL looked at the money and they were like, actually, we're not going to have enough actually to get this AWP next round that we're going to need for someone or whatever, or no, I guess it couldn't be the AWP because you'd have the AWP itself. Something scenario where you actually need, like, extra money. There might be a scenario, as mad as it sounds, where in a situation you either don't let the AWP get the last kill because he only gets $100 for that, or you actually might, in some sort of a 1v1 scenario, depending on if it's late in the game, it might actually make sense in certain scenarios on CT side, for example, where the economy's really expensive, to sometimes in a 1v1 swap out from an AWP to an AK or an M4 if possible, if the guy's low health, he's a bad player, just to increase the kill reward, to actually increase what the money you'll have. I know it's a sort of margin case, but I'm just bringing up the point, like, actually there will be scenarios where that would make sense. So anyway, the point is, I think the easy way is you just set it and forget it at 300. You go, right, no problem. Now we're all at a level of parity. Tell you what though, if they can put it down and if you can nerf things, well then why can't I come in and potentially do something else? So I actually think, bear in mind, the weapon is so expensive, especially compared to an AK. Like, theoretically, the two best guns in CSGO are the AK, especially it has to be the AK because of the raw efficiency of how much it costs, and then the AWP. And the AWP is just too much compared to the AK. That's the problem. And the CT economy is too expensive anyway. And you save nowadays. So there's all factors. So to me, I actually think 300's a fair one. But bearing in mind, you lose it so often. I actually think, by the way, if you make the kill reward higher, people won't just save as much necessarily. They might actually go for some situations. So maybe you make it 400, maybe you make it 450, maybe you make it 500, just see what happens. It's not like, by the way, you could in some way like cynically use it in the same way, like farm the kills. You wouldn't really do that, even against equals necessarily. So I don't actually know there'd be a mad downside. The other angle is just reduce the price of the AWP and keep it at 300 and reduce the price of the AWP. I would also be up for that. I think an AWP should cost maybe 4,000. That's quite reasonable, especially for what it is now, when how nerfed it is. I think 4,000 would be pretty reasonable. You still wouldn't just be spamming them everywhere. You still wouldn't be buying two AWPs all the time. I think I would actually say. But the key thing here is, you don't have to do it, Valve. You don't have to just set something. What I would do is what you should actually do, which is I would just set it, test it, watch it in pro play for like 2-3 months, then have a look at like different scenarios. Does it make sense here? Does it make sense there? What about big matches? What about random matches? What's the overall pattern? What are the outliers? What are the scenarios? How does it change how people play? Like I said, do people come up with a different sort of meta around how the AWP is bought, used and saved? Then I'd tweak it a bit more. So I would potentially do something like that. I just hate the fact it went to $100. Like, it's why it's so mad that the actual godlike players still are the AWPers. It just shows how exceptionally good they are, right? Justin Reed, what are your top 3 drum and bass albums? Now, I don't know, I can't remember if you've asked the question in the past, if you know a lot about drum and bass, but the problem here is this sounds a bit like you don't, but you know I know a lot about drum and bass, so you just want to know what my top 3 albums. So what I'll say is, and obviously in this case I'm talking to the general audiences, it's actually not an album genre. Like by definition, because of what it came out of club music, and especially, and this is a very nuanced point, the actual purpose of drum and bass singles wasn't that like many people were going to buy them necessarily, especially in the modern day, but they're going to be mixed to use in a club setting. So that's why, famously, a drum and bass song might be like 5 to 8 minutes long. But if you just listen to it, especially like the 90s and 2000s, some of it might be like quite repetitive, because the idea is you're just going to pick like which section you're going to take and put into your mix. So whether it's like a build up and a breakdown, when it comes out, you're not going to put the whole 8-minute thing. You're just going to press play on the track and sit back. It's not like there's no piece of Mozart. So I will say, as a result, there's not that many really great albums. Like a lot of the really, really, really great people only did albums as like a gimmick to sell a bunch of tracks, or sometimes if it was just a status symbol, if you got really, really big, they'd let you do an album or they'd commission it or whatever. But I have to say, actually, most of the albums, even like if I had to do like my top greatest people of all time in drum bass, a bunch of them, some of them don't even have an album. Some of them have an album, like Technical Glitch's album's not even particularly good. Like, you know what I mean? Like some of them. So I would say there's a bunch of scenarios. Like really, it's not really an album genre to me. I don't think it sits in that way. But with that said, like when people do albums, by the way, the other joke is if it was Black Sun Empire or whatever, I would always say it was always the second CD I listened to, which was the mix, which would be that plus some other stuff from their label or other friends of theirs. So for me, it's not really an album genre, but I can give you some. So what I'll do is instead of 3, I'll give you 5, because since I'm sort of picking, there's a couple here that are unbelievably good, but then some of them are just like, I generally pick tracks. So my number 1 album far and away is easily Calyx and TB, Anatomy. Now what's funny is this just shows how, as usual, I never seem to be going where the crowd go. But I don't wait and look where the crowd go. They go, I'm going the other way. Just I pick my way and then I go, where is everyone? So the mad thing is, even though some people really like this, a lot of people slag this album off and like, it's just the same like 2-step on every album with the same break. But I think it's just masters at work. This was when they were at the sweet spot of, I think they were both the absolute best in drum and bass at the time. Their collabing was unreal at this time. I think it's a little bit worse later. It's just went in different directions and Calyx decided to start singing over stuff. I'm so glad when they do the instrumental versions of those, by the way. And if you don't know, it's not they've split apart, but they're doing solo stuff again. And I was a massive fan of both separately before anyway, and this is when Calyx was really hitting his stride. So to me, this album is just unbelievable. Like almost every track, there's like 1 or 2 fillers, but the joke is, this is why I think it's the best album ever. You know how, in theory, a great album usually has like 1 or 2 or 3, like what would be singles in the old day. Like, you know, that's the AAA track. I'm not joking. If you really love this style of drum and bass, there's like 7 or 8 tracks that each could be like their best track. It is unbelievable. Like the first like 5 to 6 in a row are absolutely bonkers. It's really next level. So that's an easy one for me. Then I'm going to have to go with one of the rare, actual, really good groups that did do good albums is obviously Black Sun Empire. A massive fan of them from the Netherlands. I'm going to go with Endangered Species, which is actually technically one where they also took in like label mates of theirs like Jade and Optiv and people like that. But their tracks are unbelievable. But I think this is also like, even though like classic Black Sun Empire is extremely good, and a lot of people would call that their best work, and they think that was their, I actually think this was a sweet spot between like production level, sound quality, like a bit of experimental stuff, collabing. I actually think this is the best Black Sun Empire period. This and Cruel and Unusual, that period there is unreal. And so I think this is a mega one, and this also has one of the best mix CDs ever, by the way. It's really, really, really next level. So I think this one is absolutely bonkers. Like, there's so many tracks I would, if in the modern day there wasn't copyright issues, I would just use in CS movies and stuff, or for tournaments. Like maybe people don't know the story. Should I tell it? Put it this way, I won't say who, but there is a very famous artist, a music artist, that I actually had an agreement with, verbal agreement, that we would make it work somehow, and they were going to let me use their music. I would commission it, but they would make it for a reasonable price, and it would have been used on Flashpoint, a bunch of videos and stuff. That's actually a thing I'm very upset about with some of the Flashpoint people who lied to me, drew things out, and then just abandoned the idea. And it wasn't even about the money. They had their own silly ideas. And remember, I was the creative director. So you can see I was always hamstrung at that currently. So anyway, I think this stuff will just take esports to the next level. Then I'm going to go with the TV one, because actually TV is a rare artist that did a bunch of really good albums, mainly because of the time period of when he came out of, and he understood like the history of drum and bass, and he wanted to have his classic albums a bit like a Fortek, etc., which were the people who inspired him. The best one for me, again, in line with what I said about BSC, like maybe in terms of like every aspect, it wouldn't be my favorite, but for me, this is what makes it the best, is again, the sweet spot of production value, sound quality, like modern stuff. I think it has to be, again, similar time period of years, if you notice, TB The Legacy. Like, look, whatever that one, Space Age or whatever it was, no, Black Science Labs, the original, was obviously like the classic TB sound. But again, this is where he's just leveled all the tech up and he's even using some modern stuff. I think this one is unbelievable. This has some tracks again, which are just like works of art. Just really unreal. The build-ups are incredible. Go listen to something like Padawan. This is just some amazing stuff. That's a really good one. Also has an amazing mix CD. I'm actually going to, despite the other ones, I tended to steer away from the old school stuff and I went to more the sort of like one that's just easier on the ears. I'm actually going to go the other way for this one. I'm going to say the original first ever Concord Dawn album. So it's a self-titled. It's called Concord Dawn, Concord Dawn. Now, this is one where they obviously leveled up in many different ways later, and it's quite simplistic, but it's really good. Like, it's really, this is the sort of album you put on the background if you want to do some work. These are just some really interesting, like, soundscapes and works. And it has its own unique quality, even though it clearly pays homage to certain elements of the late 90s and early 2000s drum and bass scene in the UK, for example. I believe they're from, I think it's from New Zealand, actually. It's Australia and New Zealand. I think it's New Zealand they're from. And then the last one, I'm going to take, by the way, I could have just done a bunch of TB ones, a bunch of Black Sun Empire. I could easily fill 5 with those. That's how good those people are. But then I'll take, for a little bit of a different vibe, because this is absolutely one of my favourites. It's from a slightly different subgenre of drum and bass. It's got to be Alaska and Paradox. Spoiler, they're the same person. They're just 2 aliases of the same person. The Isolationist EP. The first 4 to 5 tracks on that, it's a very different type of drum and bass. But I remember hearing this and just being like, what on earth? What? No one told me this subgenre existed. This is mega atmospheric and all that. And so it just shows how interesting drum and bass is. Until you go down the right rabbit holes, you might just miss out on like the dawn of that whole area. And this guy is unbelievable in my opinion. So those 5, you can't really go wrong with. The spoiler, if you listen to all those 5, you don't like even 20% of the tracks. You just don't like drum and bass, at least my style of drum and bass. Maybe you like modern day stuff. Go look, like that, the Wilkinson albums are pretty good if you like just modern day liquid with a little bit of the odd Harmon break thrown in. You can't really go wrong with that. If you like Pendulum and you thought, where's all the rest of the drum and bass since? Just listen to the latest Wilkinson albums and get like some Dimension tracks or something. But they're not the greatest shit of all time, are they? Let's be real. Victator says, I believe you mentioned that you were shy and quiet in the past. I mean, the joke is this question's been brought up more times than I mentioned. Oh, but okay. How did you overcome your shyness? Now, look, I have done this a million times, but I'll maybe give you like one last aspect to it. So the quick version is you got to have a model of how you're going to succeed, right? So what you're going to do is take science. You're going to observe what's going on. You're going to analyze. You're going to look for patterns. You're going to look for outliers. You're going to do things like change some of the inputs. If I say this, if I dress this way, if I start out this way, if I start at a lower energy, what happens? If I start at a high energy, what happens? If I transition between the two, what happens? If I start a bit cheeky, what happens? If I start a bit reserved and work my way into it, if I seem to have an air of mystery, if I seem like I'm just a guy who's just easy to be around, very amiable, you try it all. So what you do is you analyze. You theorize, which crucially doesn't mean just come up with an idea. It means come up with a hypothesis, then do experiment and see what the outcome is. And then from this, it's like everything. The joke in life is, you don't want people to go with hard work, you can do anything. No, with hard work, the will to improve and the ability to humble your ego to figure out what you need to improve, then you cannot be beaten, in my opinion. Like, in my opinion, even someone who starts with massive disadvantages, if they do those 3 things, I think, here's the thing, they can't be the greatest. They could at least get to what would be an average level, in my opinion. And in fact, if you know how lazy most people are, you could probably even be slightly above average. That's why, in my opinion, by the way, you have those crazy stories where a guy with no arms and legs can play League of Legends with his mouth and being like Plat or Masters. And some of you guys have been sucking gold forever. That's because you just played the game. He actually dedicated himself to that. So he overcame you. Now, look, if you both started with like an amazing trainer and simple, theoretically, he could not be better than you, could he? You have a massive natural advantage, but you can see how he did. So that's the secret to life in general, in my opinion. Then if you just want some aside stuff, if you want literal areas to look in, I always look for masters in their field. So that means, by the way, there isn't someone like, here's how to become less shy as an esports person. Oh, the joke is it's me now, right? But there wasn't before. So you go and you look at people in fields where they take shy people, give them a game plan, give them like different things you can do, example video. Spoiler, like pickup artists, so persuasion field. You can, by the way, you can also just go into persuasion, like hypnosis, that sort of thing. That might help too. You can obviously, like a classic one for me was watching stand-up comedy to see like how the timing of jokes works, how the wording is important, how you deal with someone messing with you, how you deal with a joke that doesn't work even though you think it's funny, how you deal with a joke that you didn't think was funny but blows up. You can learn so much because that's just giving you experience, and then crucially, get your own experience. So one thing you always do in every area is put in mad reps. I don't want to say, I tried it 3 times, I tried it 10 times. Mate, I wouldn't even dare have the gall to ask for advice to someone until I tried it 100 times and figured out a few things that I'm bad at. Because do you want to know one last secret to improve? The best way to get good advice from someone who is good isn't to come up and go, I've only begun and done nothing, what should I start with? That's an insult. Because everyone knows the start guides, and mainly it just involves do a bunch of reps, and you won't do it. You want someone to go, no, here's the secret code to skip all that. There's no skipping all that. There is no skipping all that. So here's what you do if you want a really banger piece of advice from that guy. You go, I've been trying for 6 months. I've done X, Y, and Z, and these are the areas I'm bad at. I'm bad at this. I'm having problems transitioning this way. I didn't get this. I still don't understand what. And then he'll just be able to say, right, so if you're bad at that one thing, maybe try this. Oh, that thing there, you're missing out. You haven't thought of this. What about this guy? That's great. You've given him a chance there. Your analogy, by the way, is your car's broken. You don't know what's broken about it, but you don't even bring it in for the guy to see. You just go, how would you get a car to be running better? Or even worse, in this analogy, you haven't even driven your car yet. You're just like, it might, I'm probably not as good as you at driving, so how did you get really good at driving? You haven't even tried. So basically, a bunch of analogies got a bit messed up there, but you get the premise. I think that one's quick enough. By the way, I probably would do a video like that on my side channel at some point in time, just like an abstract thing of how to improve in that regard. Also, by the way, as an aside, I think I never would have added in the past is have a support network. Have people who support you, who are willing to listen or watch stuff back with you, give you some feedback. You don't have to take it, by the way. Sometimes the feedback's worth it. Sometimes it's nice to just get some and so to know that you're on the right track, you're doing well, they like this. You can try that. I'm a bit different. I don't really like that. I like my approach of I figure it out and then I go to people specifically when I need help. So I'm a bit different in that sense. It's a bit like that story. There we go. I'll put in that famous story, right? There's a story where supposedly some father and kid went to see like Mozart or Beethoven. I think it was Mozart. One of the ones who like wrote the symphonies when he was like 7 years old or something, like still, if indeed any of that's true, who knows? And they go to him and they say something like, oh, how do you write an opera or whatever, or symphony when you're 7? Because it's like the kid's 7 or 8. And then the guy sort of say, Mozart, whatever, says something like, oh, well, I wouldn't even try and do that if I were you. I would just like start out learning like the basic scales, learn some simple songs, just work your way up, and then eventually you'll get good and just see how far you can go. And then the kid goes like, but you were able to do it when you were 7. And then supposedly Mozart goes, yeah, I didn't have to ask anyone how though, did I? That's how I feel about a lot of advice. Look, I don't have a problem giving it, but do understand this. Nobody gave me this advice. I've never had a mentor in esports generally. I mean, I'll do a video one day about people who mentored me other ways. I never used to go to people earlier. I figured it all out myself. I just did. I think that's actually the secret, by the way, in my opinion. It's the greatest in all the fields. But other people are different. Other people are more social or need sort of like validation or to know they're on the right path. So it's horses for courses. Figure out what works for you. Hades Good says, I wonder if he's actually, I don't think he is actually Dutch. I think he's American as well. Because I'm saying, is it Hades Hood? I know you are a UFC/MMA fan. So what are your favorite fights in the following 3 categories? By the way, I will actually put this one myself aside and I will present it when I do that thing. I said, well, I'm going to have you guys pick one you want me to do a full video on. This is probably a side channel video. Now, favorite fights in the following 3 categories. I'll give you one for each. Actually, wait a second, would I give you one for each? Maybe I'll give you a couple for each if I can think of a few more. So there's one category is most technical fight. That's going to be fraught with difficult, but okay. Because the problem is I think most people like being boring fight without a knockout, where it's like both fighters just fight really well or tactically or strategically the game plans are well. 2, most rewatchable fight. That's a bit easier. And then 3, best non-UFC fight. That's good in the sense, by the way, that obviously most people know the UFC, but they're not going to know a lot about Pride and Bellator and ONE FC and all that jazz. So first category, most technical fight, right? I'm immediately thinking, it's just obvious, because when I think of the all-time great technical fighters, immediately Dominic Cruz's name comes to mind. I think he is actually the missing GOAT of MMA. I think if he didn't have injuries, I think he already can be a GOAT contender, by the way, but if he didn't have injuries, I think he would be the GOAT. I'm being straight up with you there. Now, true, depends if you're one of those people, depends if you're a Floyd Mayweather fan, who thinks you can be in lower weights and still be the GOAT, or whether you have to be like the heavier. Because in theory, the obvious logical thing is Floyd Mayweather wouldn't beat up Muhammad Ali if they were both the same age. Fight, because Muhammad Ali has like, what, loads and loads of pounds on him. Like, it'd be ridiculous, wouldn't it? So, and way taller, longer reach, all that jazz. So, and the obvious one that comes to mind, because it's a modern day masterpiece, is Dominic Cruz versus TJ Dillashaw. Because if people don't know, TJ Dillashaw came out of the Uriah Faber camp, which were the ones that Dominic Cruz always beating up. Like, it's famously his rival he always beats, except that one time he got that nice guillotine off. And then what happened was TJ Dillashaw took elements of that, and then obviously took elements of Dominic Cruz's. He's one of the only people ever to be able to move like Dominic Cruz did, with that genius movement, which is so unusual. To this day still works, even when he's really old. That's why he's still a legend now, barely losing fights against top contenders. Spoiler, that guy who we just lost to will probably become a champion in the UFC. That's how good Dominic Cruz is. And who did he lose to recently? Oh, another GOAT contender. Are you kidding me? Like, Dominic Cruz is unbelievably good. I think he's the most underrated great of all time in MMA. So him versus TJ Dillashaw is just a chess match. They both are doing very interesting things. It's a great style to see how they match up. And I just think this is one of the all-time masterpieces. Look, it's not super sexy. That's why it's a technical fight. Do you want a couple of other ones? Let me think. What else would we put in here? Like, one that also springs to mind is, I think I would actually take the very controversial first ever Shogun against Machida fight. The one where they like ruled it was like a draw or whatever, even though I think Shogun certainly won that fight. Again, it's just technical striking. It's a chess fight. It's very, and remember, Machida, one of the best all-time strikers ever, especially all-around game defense. I thought this was a very interesting stylistic fight of like karate Shogun or whatever that thing is against the Muay Thai kickboxing style from Brazil of those shooter box fighters. Like, this was a really, really, and this was like, basically this was like Shogun entering the years of the end of his prime. After this, unfortunately, like when John Jones beat him, spoiler, he'd had 2 massive knee surgeries. Like, yeah, John Jones would still have beaten him, but he got wrecked as a result of that. There's one. Shall I give you another one? This is one no one's going to think I'm going to pull out with. You might, a lot of people don't even cite this as an all-time great fight. I think it's a mega fight. I'll tell you one, which is, because it's 2 different styles, I want to say Carlos Condit against Big Rig. You all know who I mean, right? Hendrickson. There we go. Look, spoiler, this was a certain area of the UFC where certain things were allowed to be pumped up, as it were. But what makes this great is, one, I think it actually shows how flawed UFC and MMA scoring is. I actually think Carlos Condit won this fight. But it's all about a dominant wrestler with good striking, fighting against someone who is an all-around martial artist, good off his back, good striking, good against the cage, good out in the min, and crucially, what he shows you in this fight, Carlos Condit, is how you immediately get up even from a dominant wrestler over and over again, how you get out of difficult situations, how you do land damage, how you do damage from the bottom, how you're always a threat. I think this is just a really good cat and mouse game. And I think this was a banger fight. So there's 3 for most technical. Most rewatchable fight, right? The immediate one that comes to mind is obviously Shogun versus Dan Henderson, the first one. It's one of the all-time wars. It's one of the all-time best fights. It was a really, really good fight. Similarly, I think you can watch the hell, especially because on this one, you might even change your mind as you keep watching it every time on the winner. I would say the first ever John Jones against Alexander Gustafsson fight. What an amazing fight. Now, sure, the context for that was part of it, which is that everyone thought, in fact, Joe Rogan, props to him, he used to say, this guy's one of the only guys as tall and with a similar sort of reach, you might be able to actually sort of counter some of John Jones' stuff. He did, and I'm trying to think on that one, because I'm pretty sure in that one, that's one of the ones where they lie and say that John Jones was never taken down. But I'm almost sure like one time, at least one time, right? Didn't Gustafsson take him down? I think he did. Although, again, you'd have to get like an actual legendary wrestler in to really know. I'm not a wrestler. I can't really know how they count those things exactly. So I think that one's a really good one. There's another one you got to put up there. Most rewatchable fight. Now, here's what's sad. No, mostly I'm going for like just what fights where both people were great. A lot of rewatchable fights also are ones where someone just beats the absolute dog shit out of someone. So you know what? I actually do think if you want a really fun one, that you can take either of these. The joke is, you know the 2 guys who made the UFC by the Ultimate Fighter. So it was obviously Forrest Griffin, and then it was Stephan Bonnar. Anderson Silva's fights against these two guys are a fucking joke. He just makes them literally look like they don't even deserve to be fighters, and they can't hit him, and he just mercilessly destroys them. Like, they are mad rewatchable fights. Go watch them. They're unreal. They're unreal. In fact, you can even argue maybe that Stephan Bonner fight was the last truly great like moment in Anderson Silva's career. Best non-UFC fight. I'll give you a couple for these. First one that immediately comes to mind, I noticed actually when I tried Googling this, a load of people, this is just over history, whenever I try going back to the fight pass and look at, what do people say the top 10 fights? They all say the top fight from Pride is this fight, but I agree with them. It's not a fight with a finish, by the way. It's the first, it's Fedor against Cro Cop. If people don't know, there's a cool angle to this that you have to know as a backstory. So first of all, Cro Cop was destroying everyone. He was knocking everyone out, and he was incredibly dangerous with his head kicks. Then he had also fought against Fedor's brother, who was a very good fighter, but wasn't like an elite champion, didn't have the discipline, had a lot of personal problems. And he beat up Fedor's brother. There's a famous video on YouTube where Fedor's watching it in the back, and you can just see in his face, like, I'm going to fuck this motherfucker. And Fedor wasn't generally an angry guy like that, but you could just see this activates something in Fedor. And in this fight, all I'm going to tell you is this. Cro Cop has nothing to be ashamed of. He gets everything off you would want to. He tries all his best weapons, and Fedor takes it all and just beats him. Now, this isn't like he beats him down and destroys him. People are like, oh, he didn't. It was a really good fight, but it just shows how Fedor was on another level. This is why I still sort of think he's the GOAT. I don't know that I do, because if I start weighing it all up, then I have to start going like GSP and John Jones, Dominic Cruz comes in there. You know, you have to start doing that whole discussion, and weight classes ruin it in that regard. Put it this way, of heavyweights, I do think he's the GOAT. I think he is actually the greatest fighter ever of all time. And again, in real life, I think he would be the one who would be the best of them all. So this is a really, really, really good one. Best UFC fight. The only problem with this one, I can't remember which one it is, but actually, it's funny that everyone now loves like Michael Chandler, because like over a decade ago or whatever, he used to have all these banger fights in Bellator. He had an amazing fight against Eddie Alvarez, if people don't remember. I forget which one. They might have all been amazing from what I remember. I remember there was a couple that they had. It was really bang. That was a really next level one. You'd have to go and watch that one, I think. And then if I'm going to pick a third fight for this one, best non-UFC fight I've seen. Oh, here's a good one for you. The Nick Diaz against Takanori Gomi fight in Pride, which, by the way, spoiler, the last detail, Nick Diaz technically like loses this fight because he was tested like positive for like weed particles or something. So as Joe Rogan famously said, he beat Gomi, who was one of the all-time best in that weight class, an amazing Japanese fighter, while high, and he subbed him. Oh, that's next level. So yeah, this is definitely a side channel question, I think, because I could go into way more detail. I could do top 10 for each, but I also might just do it on my own account. But yeah, we'll see if you guys want to vote for it. Bean Burrito. By the way, in general, if you want to support my channel, you're not someone who pays for the Patreon or any of that jazz, subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, all that jazz helps. It actually does help the algorithm in the modern day. apEX is the last man standing at the elite level from the old class of French players, and with the exception of Ziwu, from any era of French players, okay? What are your thoughts on him as a player and his career thus far? Why did he outlast his peers, many of whom were gods, Kenny S. Shocks, or powerful figures, happy NBK existence? Right, the problem with that is when you say like outlast, it also feels a bit unfair, because apEX at the beginning of CSGO wasn't really that relevant for like the first year, whereas like NBK and existence were absurdly, so actually NBK probably still ties him for relevance, and NBK's been in almost every French top team ever, but okay, we'll put that on one side. Certainly outlasted Happy, Existence, Kenny Head Shocks, all that, yes. So first of all, what my thoughts on him as a player? I think his career's been up and down like nearly all players, and especially entries, because entries are it's just such a different evolving role, it's such a hard role, it depends on the rest of your team as to how good you're going to look doing it. So I would say he's certainly one of the best entries of all time. He's a contender for that. I think it's probably between him and Dupree, if I had to guess, right? Especially at this point in time. Maybe Electronic can get in there too. They have the longevity over him. So I think it's very good. I do think that we're talking about, like, if you go to like 2014 apEX, monster. If we go to 2015, bit too much pressure on him in Titan, it's hard. Then you go like 2016, 2017, really great again. Sometimes hard carrying that like G2 super teaming when they have no business. You go to the later days, I think his level he wasn't as dangerous. I mean, if you don't know, back in the day, there used to be series where he would have two maps, he'd drop 25 kills on both, and it's very rare you would ever lose a game where that happened. That's how good he was. So I do think at the time he was the best as an entry. The problem is because of the nature of that role, I actually don't think that, especially the first in entry, not just in the entry pack, it's very hard to make that like a one of your 1 or 2 stars. It's really hard to be consistent if you're going to do that. That just shows how good Simple was that they did do that with Electronic at times. That just shows how absurd, because Simple was like fragging for 1.5 people, wasn't he? So, and Electronic was extremely good at times. So, to me, the reason in Titan with RPK it wasn't good is because RPK wasn't good. So it made the pressure have to be the second star onto apEX. And they did have Kenny SB in God mode, but still, you're not going to beat the Fanatics of the world regularly if you do that. So to me, he's always better suited in his prime as the third star / the hybrid, in the sense that like he between a star and a support, as it were, because he's playing the entry roles. Why did he outlast his peers? Bunch of reasons. One, he did play the Game of Thrones better than anyone, including NBK. So he actually, in some ways, almost took over being the Kingmaker. He's like the little finger of the French scene. I think that role will last forever if you're good at it. I think it's like being a spot-up shooter or someone who can box out and rebound in the NBA. They'll always have a job for you. As long as you're keeping it good shape and you've got a good attitude, we can always use you to some degree. So I think good entries is a reason they've endured a long, long time. By the way, people like Bialy could have endured longer. People like Ferg could probably play forever if they want. Like, these guys sort of chose to let themselves get sidelined. They could have gone to other teams. I would say, crucially, and this is a key thing I think he only shares with the NBK in existence from my knowledge of the players, which is he's one of the only players from French-speaking scene that had a very consistent drive, so it was rare. He's a guy who I've never known of a year when he didn't put his hours in, or didn't put in the hours to stay in shape, or didn't try, or didn't. He seems like a guy where, look, he might not be a super cerebral guy. He has his own way of seeing the game, and I do think he always put in the hours, so I always respected that part of him. So he might seem like, oh, he's a whiner and he overreacts. Yeah, but he puts in the hours. I can handle it when you do that. It's the people who are like lazy or hubristic or egotistic, and then you're going to whine? That's what I can't really feel that, mate. Stephen Dooley. I was wondering how you would describe the distinction between your Reflections series and Talk to Thorin series, right? The main reason I invented Talk to Thorin is because I'd done a million reflections and long interviews. And then first of all, I realized, but when someone's like 2 years in their career, but they're really interested, I could do a 2-year reflections, but it's not really the same as when I interviewed the StarCraft guy. He's been in 8 years. And it feels like you sort of cheapen the series a little bit. Like I did some of that early in the On Games days, for example. And then I realized I should sort of have another series, which is like, this is just interviews. Like, now I will say I scuffed that a little bit. I sort of made Talk to Thorin like a mini reflections, or like go into more detail of 1 year on certain things, because I kind of changed my style a bit on reflections. But the original plan for Talk to Thorin, I actually think I scoffed a bit, and I might even bring back, which is I actually thought that could also be snappy interviews. Like that might just be like a 10-minute interview on one topic, like, is Ziwu overrated? Like, here we go, snappy talk. I'll literally use the player because he likes Ziwu in that sense. Let's talk to him for 10 minutes about it, get back in it, and it could be like a quick thing that could go up, because one of the problems with my channel is there's all these 2-hour, 3-hour videos, and then if people don't click on it, the hits are like just not that low, not that high rather, obviously. So in theory, spamming smaller clips would be better, right? Sort of the algorithm of the modern day. And also, I mean, it's just like the sort of the Graham Bensinger model, isn't it? So, quite frankly, like a lot of my things, I do what I want, but it's not really as set in stone. I did have an original idea that was more set, like maybe one topic or just one issue or someone who just didn't deserve reflections yet. That's why I sometimes joke with your players, like, you haven't earned the reflections yet, you know. And by the way, no matter what these pros, who cares? You're irrelevant. Behind the scenes, they you don't know how many people send me a message. I don't say anything about it. I just say thanks for the interview. Or whatever. They're like, oh, it was an absolute privilege to do this interview. I used to watch the series. This will be remembered by my... Look, like, mate. Okay, Caralho. By the way, you actually do say it like Carajo, Carayo or something, right? I just say Caralho because fuck them. Can you break down the pros and cons of the Na'Vi IGL coach dynamic? Do you think this dynamic will become more common if some of the best minds of this generation transition to coaching? If so, could you give me some candidates that could potentially reach the level of Blade? Right, so what he means is you have the actual coach was like a great IGL, and then in this case, the IGL in the game is now someone who wasn't a traditional IGL, and it's sort of, he's like trying to be the field general of the idea of sort of like, I mean, would that make the other guy the admiral or something? I don't know, colonel or something. I don't know the actual ranks of the army because obviously I'm not in it, am I? So that it's more that perspective, right? Whereas usually you'd have like a great IGL and then like just a coach who does whatever or helps and all that jazz. I mean, the interesting thing is I would say the pros is if you have a genius like a Blade, an Existence, a Zeus, Cassard, maybe Extaz, I'm not sure, we have to see with other people still. Some of these sorts of people, Zonic, it does seem like you can then help a player who isn't a great IGL sort of bridge the gap. But I think you can only bridge the gap. He'll never actually be as impactful as a truly great IGL, like a Carrigan, if they were in the game, in my opinion. So I do think the cons are you'll never fully bridge it. So you're going to have exceptional players and players who are all on the same page and are very coachable, logically very coachable, especially tactically and strategically. So I think the pros and cons make a lot of sense in that regard. Obviously, if you can't get an IGL like this is a way to make up for it, etc. Like they've done in the CIS scene when Zeus retired. Do I think the dynamic will become more common? Yes, just because it's logical these people will come into coaching roles. Carrigan, Zeus, Kassad, like some of them already are. Godbiov, I think Existence is a fool for not doing it. They would have taken him in an instant. All the really great Alexi B could maybe do it one day. Someone like Snappy could be a good coach, I think. MSL's an obvious one. There's a whole bunch of people up and down the scene that I think could do this role very, very well. I actually wonder if Nitro could be a good... I don't know about Super Tactical, but I just wonder if he could be a good coach. I feel like maybe he would have a good... If he had someone as a bit of a... Maybe if he had like a Firebrand IGL. Maybe him with Stanislaw was secretly the one we never knew all along, eh? And then in terms of... I've already given the candidates anyway. By the way, if you're wondering, I'm drinking a delicious Gamer Sops. This is the Dragon Fruit Punch one. Get 10% off your order with the code Thorin, Thorin, at gamersops.gg. It's delicious. No carbs. No calories. You don't have that silly crash. It doesn't spike you. You just go up, you go along plateau, you gradually taper off. It's great. Kind of like the career, yeah, you know what I'm doing, of Nitro. Yams in a can. It's been a while since we've seen a sports article from you. Are you still pursuing that avenue? What other sports would you consider tackling beyond MMA? Right, the reason I started the sports stuff, I was had interest in sports, is because I actually managed to get a deal with a company that was a betting company that did esports and it did sports. And so they said, can you do like cross-pollinated articles to potentially appeal to both sets of people? And so I did do that. I did one about Tom Brady and Belichick, contrasted against Faker and Coma from League of Legends. I did a whole bunch of them. The problem is, there's a direct sponsor conflict with my current sponsor. It will happen again in terms of I will do a lot of sports content. I think even sports writing will happen again. And then obviously, let's just see in the future what the situation is in my business. I think it's probably more a side channel thing that you'll see those on. You'll see some pretty spicy takes, I'll tell you that. Now, in terms of what other sports I would consider tackling beyond MMA, right, NBA, I'm an enormous NBA fan, particularly of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. I wouldn't say a massive NFL fan, but I am a massive fan of certain people and styles. So NFL's certainly one. And also I think it's the worst analysed and worst for TV punditry. So I could smoke these fools. The NHL, I'm not like an enormous fan. And I'm certainly not like the most knowledgeable, but I definitely know a lot about 80s, 90s and 2000s NHL. So there are elements of it. I actually think it's the most pure sport left in North America because of how defense is allowed to still be played and the fact that the game isn't dominated by just a star player. You actually have to have a great team and you have to have a great team system and good lines, a good coach. I think it's one of the great all-time, all-round sports along with the NFL, but they ruined the NFL defensive rules. MMA is one, actually, the ones that you wouldn't expect, but spoiler, you'll see the people on my Discord, when I post these clips, they all suddenly get into it. Because, yeah, if you like, for example, FPS games like Quake and Counter-Strike and really skilled moves, you're going to fucking love the absolute best snooker player. You're going to love the best darts player, mate. Like, go and watch, like, Ronnie O'Sullivan, Stephen Hendry. Go and watch, like, Phil the Power Taylor, Raymond Van Barneveld, Michael Gerwin. These guys are unbelievable. And once you just know the context of the sport, what they do is impossible. Like a 147 in a match to win it in snooker. How? Doing 9 darters in like World Championship. These guys are unbelievable. And then the last one is, look, I could do soccer or football. I probably will sometimes without some of my favourite players. But I'd have to very much like narrow in on that. I don't think I'm an expert on that. A lot of these games, like I'm following in the playoffs, specific players, eras, the things I'm interested in. I'm not trying to do it like esports and be totally like well-rounded and know all sorts of things. So in this particular case, it's just not my main thing. So I could do something about Liverpool or my favourite like Marco van Basten or George Weah or something like that. Some Zidane. Could do those, but I obviously can't talk about all the leagues and all the players and all that. That's why I don't make that many references unless my person I'm talking to is Legia or Kassad, someone who's in that world and that's their thing. If I'm talking to Maui Snake or Lurpis, I'm going to use NBA examples, aren't I? If I'm talking to Richard, maybe I use the NFL. You get my point anyway. NA kerfuffle. As a result of a decade of BO1 splits featuring Western teams, League of Legends, the what if BO3 scenario has a lot of angles. Yeah. For this BO3 hypotheticals, What teams would be the top contenders for you personally in the following categories for Western teams? Most likely to change in split placement. He means if the regular split was best of 3. Oh, that's actually a bit confusing. Because does he mean like if they do better and they get in the playoffs, that would change it? Yes, I think he does. He means placement at the end, not in the regular. Okay, yeah, that's right. So presumably like that would be someone who wouldn't make the playoffs, but then would. Most interesting team play style to watch in a BO3. So crucially, BO3 is going to make their style better. It doesn't play to BO1s as much. And then biggest narrative butterfly effect relative to year. So for that one, presumably he means like I say, this team wouldn't have made the playoffs, but if they made the playoffs, and not only make the playoffs, they go deep in the playoffs, maybe they even win, or they make it to Worlds, or they upset, that sort of thing. Instead of they didn't make the playoffs, it was over. Because that's just League of Legends and how trash the LCS is and the USL was for so many years. So let me think how I'll do this. Right, first category, most likely to change in split placement. The immediate one that comes to mind is Origin in Season 9 Summer. Now, true, after summer, at the end, they would have had the problem with cold, where maybe it would have still wrecked it. Maybe he wouldn't have been available for Worlds. He had a whole situation going, I don't know. And that might have been a big problem. Although then again, if you actually got the World spot, I imagine you could get a really good jungler potentially coming as a stand-in. I don't know on that one. Not Zanzara, spoiler. But I do think that team, I mean, for the first part, watch the first round robin of that summer split. They were like arguably the best team. And they'd just come off the spring where they were better than Fnatic, and they were one of the only teams that could go head to head with G2. And actually, people overrate the fact G2 beat them in that final in that way. Because if you go and hear the stories, G2 was doing all that wild stuff where they were like doing all these crazy picks that like, if they just did a normal draft against each other, I actually think OG was the team that could play that team the best because they had the all-round talents. They had like very good to medium talents at every position. There was no weak spot in general, especially because Mithy made up for like the fact he wasn't so good and he did a little bit as a spot with his mind and leading the team, in my opinion, or helping the team break things down. So OG in Season 9 summer feels obvious because I think if they made the playoffs, I do think they would have like won a series, or they could have gone deep and been a semis team or maybe a finals team. That would have potentially put them into Worlds. At Worlds, I mean, who knows what happens at that point in time? It's a really nice set of players, isn't it? They're all still pretty good at this point in time. I think that could have been so interesting. In terms of likely to change split placement. Is there anyone else that never made the... Like, look, an obvious one from last year. It wouldn't have been amazing, but it would have been interesting. Is if, like, Vitality with Perks and Harrow had made it. Like, up until that last week, it looked like they weren't. It looked like they were, like, the second or third best team in the LEC. That would be very interesting. Maybe they could have snuck a spot. Maybe they would have taken Mad Lion's spot at Worlds. That would be interesting. There's one for you. I don't think they could have won the split, but I do think they could have come like second or third, maybe. That would be very interesting. I'd like to have seen them against Fnatic in the playoffs, put it that way. Or an XL. But I guess it would have been XL they'd have gotten in over. Then for the category which was most interesting playstyle to watch in a BO3, I still think it's just going to be G2 2019. It's just an amazing team because the cool thing about them was they would have had all those games where they beat in the mid-game. They would have the games where they come from behind. They'd have a game where they'd stomp you and try silly picks. In a best of 3, they'd try even more crazy draft angles. I still think it'd be the most entertaining team to watch, and the playstyle would be mad entertaining. It'd be incredible. It's sad they never were in an LCK/LPL. We didn't get that many games of those guys. Not as many as you think. Think how many best of X series we got. Another obvious one for that one feels like, let me think. I actually think the problem with this one, most interesting play style. You know, I actually thought that like the Season 9 Cloud9 lineups were pretty good. The Svenskeren ones with Reaper coaching. I think in best of 3, because he's an amazing drafter, I think they would be a very interesting team in the regular season. They could have been they might actually have been the better team, by the way, who knows? And then, even though on this one, I'm actually having to go purely hypothetical. I'm going to pick from the same season and split I just did for biggest narrative butterfly effect. If they had in Season 9 with Team Liquid, with Jensen, have properly like dedicated themselves, because it was BO3s, and played really hard, because they were an amazing team mid to late, I think that team could potentially, if they'd actually applied themselves, have been very dominant. They could have done one of those splits in BO3s. Like we went like 17-1. They could have done one of those like TSM 2016 Season 6 Summer. So if they'd have done that, I think it totally changes how strong people would think they were, despite their style maybe not spitting the early game, mid-game strengths of the other regions. And then when you added in the MSI run, I think actually, look, obviously even at Worlds, by the way, they beat like, didn't they beat like Damwon in a game? Or I think it was IG they beat in a game. I don't think they beat Damwon in a game. Oh, that doesn't make sense though, because didn't they 6-0? I think it was IG they beat in a game. Whatever. whatever on that one. Doesn't matter, does it? But the point is, I think collectively, people would think of that year very differently. I think it really would be held as contender for the best NA team ever, whereas a lot of people don't do that. Or they think it's some whack shit like Cloud9 and TSM in the past or whatever jazz. Is there another one for that one? Biggest narrative butterfly effect. Maybe if we go back in the day. Oh, I'll give you one. I do think, because if people don't know, in season 3, when it was Evil Geniuses and Snoopy was whack and Crepo and Yellow Pete weren't as relevant because ADC was less powerful and Wicked Champion Pool was a problem, and Froggen was still just, in my opinion, the best Western mid laner. I think if he'd ever had BO3s, he could actually have gambled on some of the assassins more on one game, and he would have seen some Zed and Fizz games that were more in the line with what an X-Spec Alex Ich was doing, or even a PX in the Nuke Duck eventually. And then I also think you would have just seen his consistency at that time was almost impossible. I think he was one of the most unplayable League of Legends players ever. I don't care what you think. You probably didn't watch the seasons. You don't remember him like I do. You haven't studied him. I don't care. So I just think that would actually, it would be way easier to put them in the kinds of positions I have, like Tharth all the time or whatever. Like if you actually saw more of a body of work that year, sadly didn't go to World City and there was no MSI, etc. And his team wasn't winning anyway. I work hard to make sure I get mine, but no one can do it all on their own. And that's why everyone needs a support group. And so I have my Patreon community. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask a question in one of these monthly AMAs. Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are. Or maybe you want to take part in one of those long discussions where you can help set the table of the topics and join in with other like-minded people. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link below, as the following people who I very much appreciate did: Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Ahmed Hadjou, Kyle, Bot Pounder 420, Toucan, Animosity, Tobias Bernasconi, Jensen Goh, Tosh, and always, you know it, a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion.